Okay, by way of introduction, the way I wanted to start this off is by mentioning that very recently I had a conversation with a few friends of mine who already own this game and had messed around with it a little bit. And in the process of talking to them and potentially talking about doing a co-op campaign together, it became very clear that the game is quite overwhelming for a lot of players, particularly though even people who might already own it and who have maybe even played it a little bit. But for people who just haven't been playing it hour after hour, day after day, like so many of us have, this can get a little bit intimidating when you look at all of the different factions that are available, and then when you dive within the different races, different legendary lords that are available for for even some of the individual races. Each lord, or in most cases, the factions themselves having different mechanics that you have to get used to. It can all really add up to be a lot. So my first thought when I started thinking about this video, what would be the top 5 starting factions to play if I was going to recommend this game to somebody who was just getting started, or maybe had already messed around with it a tiny little bit but gave up for whatever reason. I thought to myself, is there any point in making such a video? The game's been out for a few years. Surely people at this point don't really need to know what the best starting factions are. And then I gave it a little bit more thought, and I thought, you know what? I think there is some value in making this video because, first of all, CA and what they recommend to you, with one exception, I would say don't pay any attention to this. They recommend starting with the Empire. They recommend starting with Grand Cathay. They recommend starting with the High Elves. Well, I'm going to make an argument that the High Elves, at least one of the legendary lords for the High Elves, is a legitimate one. That's a good one to start out with, but I certainly would not recommend either the Empire or Grand Cathay for various reasons that I'll touch on, but not get into a whole lot of detail in just a moment. But in any case, I wanted to make it very clear. So this video is really not just for people who are brand new to the game, but maybe people who are just not as familiar with it, and this can get a little bit overwhelming looking at all these different options. So I thought it'd be helpful to talk about what are the best starting races, or the best starting legendary lords, I should really say, for people in that circumstance. And one thing I want to make very clear right away is this does not mean who are the most powerful factions. That's a completely different video if you're interested in just who are the most powerful factions overall. Now, that most powerful can actually mean any number of different things. And one of the 3 things that I consider to be of paramount importance when choosing a good starting legendary lord includes power to a certain extent, but I wouldn't phrase it as a most powerful faction or most powerful legendary lord overall, but instead I would phrase it as a who is good in the early game. So let's talk about this. What are the 3 things then that I would consider to be really important factors in determining what makes for a good starting faction? So I think mainly 3 things that are really important, and all 3 of them have to exist for it to be a good starting faction. Number 1, they have to be using mechanics that are relatively straightforward, not too complicated. That way, a player who's kind of familiarizing themselves with the game can focus on the strategy and tactics that they might know from other Total War games. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of learning faction mechanics or legendary lord mechanics, because that's the case with all of these, but nothing too overly complicated. For that reason, I ruled out a couple of the things, like Tomb Kings are so unique in the way that they do some of their mechanics. Another good example would be like Warriors of Chaos. They can be very powerful and reasonably good in the early going even, but they're a little bit more complicated. I wouldn't recommend this as a faction to start with. It wouldn't be the best introduction to the game to kind of learn the game overall. Beastmen are another one that I feel like Beastmen are one of my favorite factions to play, races to play. They're extremely powerful when you kind of figure out how to play them correctly, but they take a little bit of getting used to, and they're so unique. They're not like any of the other factions. So little things like that, I think, sort of cross certain races off the list. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to pick some legendary lords that have easily digestible, easy to understand starting mechanics. Second thing is, it's good to have a legendary lord whose benefits play a role in the early game. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and talk about one of them right away. Let's take a look at Teclis. I'm sorry, not Teclis, excuse me, his brother, Tyrion. Tyrion is a good legendary lord whose benefits just happen to apply to units that you start the game with and also can start building right away at the beginning of the game. So I think that's important to have a good starting legendary lord whose benefits apply right away from the very beginning of the game. In the long run, there are going to be other legendary lords who ramp up and will be more powerful as you get later on in the game because of the benefits that they maybe provide to late game, high tier units. But in the early going, being able to buff your 1 and 2 tier units can be really useful. And then the third thing that I think is really important is kind of what I alluded to from a difficulty standpoint, which is not factions that are not necessarily powerful, but have a really good starting, stable starting situation, meaning you're not under threat right away. You can't screw up the campaign in the first turn or two and get yourself overrun and your campaign already be over. Instead, they start out with a good, safe location where you're not really under too much duress, and it gives you a little bit of time to get kind of sink your teeth into the mechanics and the units and things like that, and sort of learn on the fly and not have to worry that you would make a simple mistake early on that would cause you to potentially lose your game right away. So, okay, no, I think that's enough prelude. I think hopefully that makes sense. We want legendary lords who are good with their starting armies. We want factions that have mechanics that are relatively straightforward, and we want legendary lords that have good starting situations where it's kind of stable and you can kind of learn while you're playing and not have to worry about getting overrun right away. So those are the three factors that I consider to be the most important ones for choosing starting factions. So let's go ahead and jump back. Now this is going to be in no particular order. I haven't ranked 5 down through 1. I just think these are probably the top 5 that I would recommend to people who are getting used to, or who are just getting back into the game, or just getting into it for the very first time. So I guess since I'm already here, let's go ahead and start out talking about Tyrion. So he's got the obvious benefit, as I just alluded to. He's got good upkeep reduction costs for units that you not only start out with, but you can start building right away. So let's go ahead and dive into him and talk about his starting situation.
Sons and daughters of Ulthuan, be ready to fight!
Okay, so here we are. Tyrion, how they play, a little bit of an easy a simple explanation here. Earn influence throughout your campaign to use for political events and to recruit lords and heroes. It's just one additional currency that High Elves get that other factions don't get, and it allows you to use the, you can do a couple things with it. You can use your influence for this intrigue at the court, which is a way to improve or decrease relations between two factions, including yourself with other factions, but you can also use it to make friends or enemies of two different factions if you want to. Can be quite useful, but it's not too difficult to understand. And then the other thing that you use influence for is to recruit in your lords and your heroes. The more influence that you have, the more expensive in terms of influence you can afford to spend on lords and heroes, which essentially gives them better traits. So let's go ahead then and talk a little bit about Tyrion in particular. He's a pretty basic High Elf legendary lord, and he does start out with some pretty basic units here. You got yourself a little bit in the way of cavalry and these Flamespire Phoenixes, but for the most part, you've got your spearmen and your Lothran Sea Guard here. You've got your archers, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You start with a wizard, so you got all your basics available to you here right away. And let me just show you, if we go into the recruiting screen, you can see right away you can start to recruit archers. Archers and spearmen are units, if we take a look here, his own personal benefit. So this is only for him as a lord, so it only applies to his own army. But you can see right here, upkeep minus 50% for spearmen and archers and rangers and a few others. But I wanted to mention them in particular because those are all units that you can recruit right away at the very beginning of your game. Your starting enemy is, of course, here the Cult of Excess. These are Dark Elves, very thematic. Now, I would normally always recommend fighting your first battle. In fact, I recommend fighting almost all of the battles manually, but I certainly would recommend for a new player who's just getting started, you want to fight your battle manually as opposed to doing an auto-resolve, because this is a good opportunity to get a feel for how your units will, what they're good at in battle, what they're not so good at. It's a good way to kind of just get used to using these units correctly. Fighting battles manually, for me, is the most fun part of the game, but really for anybody who's interested in this game, this is how you get better as a player, just basically with practice. There will always be times where you need to fight some manual battles. Most of the time, you should be able to do better in manual battles than what auto-resolve would do for you. And so it's just, there's no substitute for it. You need to get the practice in learning how to use your units effectively and how to counter the enemy units effectively. And that's, like I said, how we get better as players. There's going to be times where you need to do it because it's going to be a really close battle that might be a loss on auto-resolve, but you can turn it into a win. Certainly you can win battles and suffer fewer casualties by fighting it manually as opposed to doing auto-resolve. Having said all that, I'm going to auto-resolve right now just for purposes of expediency here to show you again, to take a look at the starting or sort of the strategic situation that Tyrion starts out with. So we're going to go ahead and take this treasury and influence here at the very beginning because we need to start building up our influence. It's quite important for High Elves. Like I said, it's an additional currency that the High Elves get that other factions don't. Every faction uses money, or in some cases it's called something else like favor, but it's essentially the same thing for every faction. But then many factions do get a separate one or more currencies that they have to juggle as well. Okay, so here we are. We've won our first battle. We can get some skill ups here, but I'm not going to go through all that. I did want to point out that you've got an enemy settlement here that you can march on here in turn number 1. But even after taking that, you can see overall this province starts out, you've got Lothran, the enemy has got 3 different settlements. But the good news is you should be able to take one of those settlements from them in the first turn, which makes it 2 versus 2. Already you can see how you're in a good starting situation in terms of being stronger than your enemy. You win that first battle, you take the first of their starting settlements, and you've already now pushed them down to only 2 smaller minor settlements, so you've already got the power advantage over them. But here's really the main thing to consider for Tyrion. Lothran is a very, very strong region. It's a very strong capital city. It's got landmarks. It's got good income. This province, this is a very good starting province. Once you finish conquering all three of these other provinces or regions, you would have the entire province available to you. Makes for a really good base of operations then for the rest of your campaign. And how does that campaign play out? Well, in the early going, you've got lots of friends around you. So again, pretty, for this game, not overwhelmingly difficult starting situation. It's nice to have quite a few friends around you. You don't have to play nice with them if you don't want to, but certainly as a starting player, that is something that you have available to you. Good income, limited number of enemies to fight right away, which can actually kind of be a detriment in certain cases, but if you want to, you can go right away here towards the greenskins, or you can even go out into the water and sail around and find enemies that are across the seas. You can come up here and help out the other high elves fighting the forces of the dark elves up here. So you've got lots of friends available to you. You've got limited enemies right away, but that again gives you sort of a stable base of operations for the beginning of your campaign. As you can see, we could, if we wanted to, again, auto-resolve, immediately take the second settlement just to show you how easy it is to take that second settlement. Although, again, I do recommend doing it in manual battle instead of as an auto-resolve. But just in case you wanted to see how easy it is, there you go. Occupy, boom. You've already cut the enemy's power by 1/3 here on the first turn, really by more than 1/3 because you defeated an army as well. They're down to these 2 minor settlements. They have no other armies left. It's pretty much yours for the taking right from the get-go. All right, enough said about Tyrion. So what about the other two while I'm on this screen? The Empire and Grand Cathay, who they also recommend. Yeah, I don't recommend them. They're fun to play, but number one, the faction mechanics are a little bit more complicated for both the Empire and for Cathay. Also, the main thing is their starting situation is a lot more challenging than it is for many of the other factions. So they're good ones to start out with if you want to have lots and lots of enemies coming at you right away. And some slightly more advanced mechanics to have to learn, but I don't think they're good suggestions for your average player who is trying to learn the overall feel of Warhammer 3 rather than spending their time learning specific faction mechanics while fighting off invasions, which happen right away. So instead of them, who would be another good choice to look at for a starting faction? Well, I think let's kind of go from the High Elves to the Dark Elves. I believe that Malekith is also in a good starting location in terms of having some stability from the very beginning of the game. He's got good positive effects here including for starting units. So just like how the High Elves had the upkeep reduction for their low tier basic melee infantry and missile infantry units, you get the same thing here with Malekith. So upkeep minus 25% for units including Dread Spears, Bleak Swords, and Dark Shards. And then his other Lord effects here, pretty straightforward, pretty simple to understand, but still quite powerful. So he's a reasonably powerful legendary Lord with very easy mechanics. Let's go ahead and jump in and look at his starting situation.
All bow before the Witch King.
Okay, so Dark Elves, pretty simple mechanic as a faction, or I should say as a race, because this is one thing that all the different Dark Elf lords do share, which is they're all about slaves. And basically, you get slaves, for the most part, from fighting battles. A couple of other things. You can get slaves from raiding, for example, as well. But as long as you're continuously fighting battles, you should be fine in that department. Again, it's another currency that you need to manage, like with influence with the High Elves. It is unique, of course, to the Dark Elves. You also get a black arc mechanic, which I will mention very briefly. Basically what black arcs are fleets that can attack coastal cities, but they can't obviously move inland. Black arcs are extremely powerful in this game, largely because they have massive, massive upkeep reductions. So you can get really pretty strong units into a black arc army and only have to pay 50% or even less than 50% of what the upkeep of that army would normally be. But anyway, so and you can't basically you get those. I'll just mention it very quickly for anybody new. You get that via this sacrifice to Mathlin rite, which costs 800 slaves. So every time you do that, and there's a timer on it, so you can only do it once every 25 turns. But at that point, then you execute this rite, you spend 800 slaves, you get yourself availability to start a new Black Arc army, or navy, whichever term seems most appropriate. Anyway, so that's all there is to that. Then you do start out with a sorceress. She is, I think, always a sorceress of fire, which is good, particularly useful for people who are just kind of getting used to using magic in this game. You've got some really good offensive spells. Okay, go ahead and move your sorceress into your army. Now your army right here. As we mentioned, you start out with some dread spears, you start out with some bleak swords, you start out with some dark shards, and you even get a higher level Blackguard of Nagrand. All of those things are extremely convenient for good old Malekith because, oops, sorry, it's not him personally, it's actually the faction effect. The faction effect is that you do have upkeep reduction for all of those units. So these units are actually less expensive turn after turn to pay for than they would be for other Dark Elf factions. And then your starting enemy here is the Skaven. The one interesting thing about the Skaven is their settlements look like ruins, but you can almost always tell when a ruin is actually a Skaven settlement because it will have this Skaven corruption. Pretty easy to identify that way most of the time. And then the other thing to keep in mind here for Malekith overall is his capital city, just like the case with Tyrion. The capital city is in a good location. It's quite strong. It's able to defend itself from enemies, and you don't really have any enemies that are likely to attack you in the early game anyway, so you have plenty of time to build this up. You can turn it into a little bit of an economic powerhouse. It doesn't have as many different regions in the starting province here, the Iron Foothills, as was the case with Tyrion. But you could still kind of turn this into an economic powerhouse because you can build buildings that basically allow you to use slaves to bump up the amount of income that you're earning. So in any case, the main thing to keep in mind is that you've got a stable base of operations for starting your campaign. It's very, very unlikely that you're going to suffer any serious danger in terms of an enemy coming up here and taking it anytime soon. Again, you can go ahead and just do your attacking right away. Again, I also recommend fighting this manually, but in this particular case for expediency, I'm going to go ahead and auto-resolve it. You can see we don't take all that much damage in auto-resolve. Choosing this middle option right here, Enslave, is what I find myself doing most of the time. Instead of taking the straight-up loot, I like getting the army replenishment and the slaves. Always a good way to keep getting your slave count up. And then, after that's done, taking a look at your starting enemy, these Skaven, they've got this settlement right here, they've got this settlement right here, and they've got this settlement right here. Just those three. If you take a look here at... Oops, I'm sorry, they have a fourth one somewhere. So anyway, they start out with 4, but you're going to take those from them very quickly. Is it you right here, Temple of Cain? Nope, it's not you. Is it down here? Yep, it's down here. It's a Shroktak Mount. Now, the thing to keep in mind with them, they start out with the 4 settlements, but what's kind of interesting about them is they start out with multiple enemies. And so Grombrindal and the Ancestral Throng are also at war with them. So what's going to end up happening is the Skaven here are going to be fighting not just you, but they're going to be fighting another major faction, which is Grombrindal's, who starts out over here. So it's almost a race between you as Malekith and Grombrindal to come up here to Altar of Ultimate Darkness. Grombrindal will come up this way, take a settlement here, probably in his first or second turn, and then work his way up here towards the Altar of Ultimate Darkness. If you're quick about it, you should certainly be able to get there before he does. But in any case, you can at least press on. Let's go ahead and give you your route marcher here. You can press on and attack right here, Hard Cauldron, in the first turn. Still a decisive victory. You could auto-resolve it if you wanted to. Again, not recommending it, but just to show you what would happen, you can go ahead and boom, take your first successful conquest and second settlement in the very first turn. Puts you in a pretty good starting position moving forward to continue the war against the Skaven. Let's go ahead and occupy it. And the good news is, with just this one conquest in the first turn, you have now secured your first province. You own this entire Iron Foothills province, which is going to allow you to now choose a commandment. Let's say that you probably want to maybe do one of these is good for recruitment right here. So you could obviously go for control, could go for growth. I personally would probably start with the sacrifices for Cain so that you can get a little bit of a benefit to recruiting, because in the very early game it's always important to do some recruiting. But there you go. Pretty solid start and easily obtainable starting situation for Malekith. All right, so the next starting faction that I would recommend to a starting player is from the race of the Dwarves, particularly with the changes that CA recently introduced in terms of the deep roads. I really enjoy the Dwarves, but they're particularly good for starting players because they're a faction that's quite easy to play in both the campaign and on the battlefield, and I'll explain that in just a moment. But what's a little bit different about the Dwarves as opposed to the other two that we just did, I don't recommend going with the first guy who shows up in the list, the original leader of the Dwarfs, which is Thorgrim Grudgebearer. He's fine, but I don't think he's the best choice for a starting player. Instead, I recommend Thorek Ironbrow. And the reason is Thorek's starting position is more stable than any of the others. And also it gives you a little bit of flexibility, which I'll talk about in just a moment when we get into the campaign map itself. But also an important thing to keep in mind is he's really good at buffing Quarreler units, which are a really strong unit to focus on very heavily in the early game. And so I think he's just a wonderful legendary lord for that reason. It's nice to buff your melee units, don't get me wrong, but your melee units already start out quite strong. It's really the ranged units for the Dwarves, whether we're talking artillery or whether we're talking missile infantry. That's where your damage dealing comes from for the most part with your Dwarves. And so it's really nice to have this reload time reduction available on your Quarreler units. It's going to make them shoot faster, and there's some other buffs that he provides them when we look at his skill tree as well that are going to make the Quarrelers particularly powerful. And so, yeah, that's what I would recommend for a starting player, starting with the Dwarves. You've got really solid melee infantry to hold the line, and then you just kind of fill up the rest of your army with these Quarrelers who are really, really effective early game units in terms of dealing damage. So let's jump in and talk about him.
In King Cazador's name, I will unearth the lost relics of our ancestors and bring glory to the Dowie once more.
All right, so the dwarves are, I mentioned the deep roads mechanic that was recently introduced, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on that in just a moment. But the other main thing to think about with the dwarves, each faction, as we've talked about already, has a unique currency which they have to manage. In this case with dwarves, it's called Oath Gold. This Oath Gold is what will allow you, I can't actually click on it here in turn number 1, but it allows you to actually build your own magic items, which can be extremely useful. And again, you pretty much will be accumulating this pretty much automatically through a combination of your traits, I should say the sort of the uniqueness of your characters, also certain buildings provide it, and then from winning battles. The other mechanic to keep in mind for the dwarfs is this Age of Reckoning. So the more fighting that you do, the more grudges that you will resolve, which basically advances you along this Age of Reckoning. It's not very difficult to understand the concept. The more victories that you win and the more grudges that you resolve, the farther up the Age of Reckoning you will go. It provides some pretty easy to understand buffs. If you go without fighting much at all, you'll suffer a little bit in the way of debuffs, but they're not really particularly debilitating. And that's important, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So the starting situation for Thorek is, the reason why I would pick him over any of the other dwarfs is right here. Karak Zorn is in a really safe location, okay? It's not overall, it's not the world's most powerful province in terms of being an economic powerhouse, but it's pretty good. You've got your gold mining resource chain right here, which is going to give you lots of money. You've got this this deeps mechanic, and you've got this landmark here. So you've got a lot going for you here in Karak Zorn, but the main thing that you have going for you is it's a provincial capital, walled city, pretty good defenses, and no real enemies close by that are likely to threaten it in the early game. So it allows you to kind of focus on what you want to do offensively. So let's go ahead and grab our starting hero here. In this case, this is a runesmith. We're going to throw this into our army. You start out, as I mentioned before, with these Quarrelers, and these are really good units to use in the early going. As damage dealers, you also have your Grudge Throwers. If we take a look here at Thorek, the old ways are best. You can see both the Grudge Thrower and the Quarrelers do benefit from this reload time reduction, which is quite nice. And then when we look at his skills, we can start to see, if I could find it here, he's got some really powerful skills. I really like Thorek. So right here, this one right here, Proven Tools, this allows AP missile damage increases to your Quarrelers. So that's really the one sort of weakness of your Quarrelers in the early game. Once you start facing armies that have higher armor, they don't have very good missile strength against armor piercing, or I should say against armor in the early going, but you can boost that. So he's really good at doing that. Starting enemy are these greenskins right here. This is just a minor greenskins faction. A little bit of a tougher battle here in the early going. I will say this was something that I considered. The fact that a Ragnarok spider is in this starting army does make this a little bit more challenging than the examples that we've looked at before, but it's nothing that you can't overcome. If you were to auto-resolve this, you would end up losing a bunch of these units. You'll have to trust me on this one. If you fight the battle manually, you can certainly win this without losing these units. So that is the one thing to keep in mind that makes this a more complicated faction to begin with. But get past this first battle, and this Arachnos faction is extremely weak at that point moving forward. So when it comes to fighting as the dwarves, you kind of can use a pretty standard formation. I mentioned in the introduction to the dwarves that they're pretty easy to fight with in battle. That's because they're not terribly mobile, but they're extremely strong with melee infantry. So you basically just need to set up a nice defensive perimeter around your damage dealing units, and use your damage dealers, in this case the Quarrelers and the Grudge Throwers here, to do the damage to the enemy, while your melee infantry just take forever to go down. Because you start out with artillery, you basically put the enemy in a situation where he has to come towards you from the very beginning, which is always advantageous as well. So we're going to go ahead and lob our grudges here. We're going to throw our grudges at the orc boys here in the middle. It's a little bit difficult to use artillery like these grudge throwers against fast units, so we'll hit a nice slow unit right there. There's value in doing damage to them. We just want to make sure that we don't allow their flankers to get around us and into our back line. That's really the one trick with playing the Dwarfs, is that you need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So right here, they've moved into range over here. Let's go ahead and get our Quarrelers shooting at them right there. Try to take out this unit right away. As you can see, we do pretty good damage to them. I've lost track of their flankers over here. Yep, they're in the trees right there. As long as you protect your damage dealers, you should be in pretty good shape. Go ahead and got them. We've got them broken. Let's go ahead and switch to these guys right now. And we're also going to have really useful characters like Thorek himself and our runesmith, who can come out and do quite a bit of tanking on their own. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and start sending them forward towards the enemy lord right here. Then we want to go ahead and make sure that we hold formation against anybody, like right here, okay? I kind of was a little bit slow on this. He's getting into our back line right there. That's the one thing you got to watch out for, is letting the enemy flankers get into your back line. Okay, I don't know why you guys are moving. All you had to do was turn around and shoot. Okay. Now that we've already let the flankers around that side, we can start to get these other units in position. So even though they got into our back line, it's okay. We're going to go ahead and get our grudge throwers back on their catapults here. We've got those guys broken now. You got in position to fight them over here. Okay, there we go. Now we need to worry about their archers. You can go ahead and hit them from the flank. Now, keeping in mind that for a starting player, let's go ahead and also do our buffs over here. So, keeping in mind that when you're not playing on Legendary Very Hard difficulty, which is what I play on, you can pause during battles, which is obviously going to be something that you'll want to do when you're first learning the game. Let's get you guys turned around and firing this way. We've got them wavering over here because our melee infantry are just very strong. They're just really able to hold out for a long time. Okay, we probably need to worry about Thorek here. He's starting to take a little bit too much damage. It's okay. Let's go ahead and get you on him. Thorek, we're pulling back. You guys right here are holding your own against that Arachnarok spider. We've got you guys now. We've got their archers running away. Let's go ahead and get you shooting at them. Let's get you shooting at them as well for now. Thorek, let's go ahead and boost these guys right here. Get them on the Arachnarok spider. You can get on the Arachnarok spider. We've got all of those units running away. We've got them about ready to run away. Pretty soon now, I think it's safe for us to go ahead. As soon as they break right there, they broke, we can turn around and make sure we're shooting this Arachnarok spider. Right here, we're finishing off the enemy lord. You are kind of chasing a unit that you'll never catch up with, so that's probably not ideal. Let's get you back over here. These guys are starting to get back in the fight, but they are severely weakened. Let's go ahead and get you shooting at them back there. Tell you what, let's get you shooting at those goblin archers. They're going to be a little bit easier for you to hit. You, I think we're about ready to get you back into the fight. We've got the enemy lord shattered. There we go. Victory. Okay. At that point, you could keep fighting if you wanted to. There's really no reason to at this point, so we're going to end the battle. So you can see how even if you mishandle the battle, like I allowed their flankers to get around behind and into our grudge throwers, even with a mistake like that, you can still handle this starting enemy pretty easily and not lose any units. So that's why you do want to make sure you fight manually as opposed to doing an auto-resolve. Coming out of it, you got a couple different choices. I usually take Oath Gold and Treasury, but there are times where you would maybe choose any of the three. Let's go ahead and take the Oath Gold and Treasury. In this case, though, always good to get as much money and as much Oath Gold as you can get in the early going. And now, having done that, we can advance on and take our second settlement here. Tell you what I'm going to do before I do that. I should be showing, you know, the right way to do things, and that is coming out of that first battle, you do get yourself some skills. Usually I automatically go with Route Marcher right away, but you could take something that would improve him in combat and with you Rune of Speed. So now we're level 2 characters going into this battle against Lost Plateau. Now we could auto-resolve if we wanted to. Again, I don't recommend it. I recommend fighting the battle manually. But if you did want to auto-resolve, you can do so, and you've got yourself your second settlement. Occupy it. And boom, you can now see that in terms of your starting province, you've got 2/3 of it already owned. And this third one, Mount Arachnos right there, it's yours for the taking because Arachnos actually has another settlement up there. You can see we've completely wiped out their military strength. That's what's seeing this bar is all green. Green is how strong you are relative to red being how strong they are. When you see no red at all, it means that they've been completely wiped out from a military standpoint. So they have no armies left at all. They've got 2 settlements, one right here, one right here. You can pretty much march up here and take Mount Arachnos as quickly as possible. We'll go ahead and do that here really quickly. I tend to like taking Dwarf Warriors with shields as my starting units. Let's go ahead and take Inspiring Presence. Let's go ahead and take, where is it here? Wrath and Ruin. This is a nice damaging spell that I often use. Get a little bit of replenishment right away. You get a little bit of recruiting done right here. You have this building right here. Normally, I would never suggest building this barracks line of buildings in your major settlement because instead you want to save your settlements that go all the way up to level 5. You want to save them for the building lines that go up above 3. Because the building lines that only go as high as 3, you can build those in the minor settlements where there are fewer slots. But in this case, I'm actually going to go ahead and recommend upgrading this barracks in Karak Zorn right away. The reason being, you want to get access to Quarrelers as soon as possible, and you don't have access to those until you get to level 2. So what I would recommend doing is getting this built up to level 2. Takes 2 turns to do it. Recruiting as many Quarrelers as you can fit then into Thorek's army at that point. Recruit Warriors until you get to that point, and then switch over from recruiting Warriors to recruiting Quarrelers. That way you'll have a nice mix of melee infantry to hold the front line and lots of Quarrelers to do your damage in his starting army. That then becomes a very powerful starting army for the early game. Okay, so then you go to turn 2. You've got your 2 additional warriors recruited, and you can go ahead and reach Mount Arachnos in turn 2. He's got no army there defending it, so boom, there you go. Easy victory. Occupy. and you've got yourself your entire starting province already consolidated. Now you can go ahead and do a commandment here. I generally focus on the growth and construction cost reduction for the dwarfs, but you can pick whatever most appeals to you. Anyway, really strong starting situation here for Thorek in the early going. Your only enemy right now is still just Arachnos, the Greenskins. There's the other settlement that I mentioned up here. It's going to take a little while to get up there. He will have enough time to build up another army, but trust me, you've got the advantage over him. You do also then have some other major factions around, so it doesn't take very long to go from fighting these greenskins to having to worry about some of your other enemies, but you're in a very strong starting situation to be able to deal with them. The other thing to think about with Thorek, and as with the other Dwarven legendary lords as well, that deep roads mechanic that was just introduced really gives you some options. So with Thorek, you can basically go one of two different directions. You could continue to expand. I would suggest expanding northward, wiping out Arachnos, and then from that point forward, you got some Skaven, you got some Tomb Kings, you've got some different enemies. Scarbrand is not that far away. Different enemies that you can fight towards the north if you want to go that way. Kroq-Gar is sort of a natural ally, I guess I would call him. For Thorek, so you're both order anyway, so you could basically secure your southern border by being friendly with him, but you could attack him if you wanted to expand southward instead. But being the dwarves with the deep roads mechanic, you also have the option now to not even have to expand at all, or at least expand at your own pace. There's no real need to race to expand with the dwarfs now. If you're interested in going tall instead of wide, you can focus on building up the deep roads in your starting capital, and you can become a relative economic powerhouse without having to expand very much. So it's just the flexibility of his position where he could kind of chill for a little while in the early game if he wanted to. So those first three are really easy recommendations to make. The last two I gave a lot more thought to, and there's a little bit in terms of pluses and minuses with them, but I'm reasonably comfortable with making these last two as recommendations for starting players. So the Vampire Counts are an interesting faction that are just a little bit different than other factions. Their mechanics are not difficult to understand, and they're actually quite cool and quite powerful in the early game. So that's one thing in their favor. The one thing to keep in mind, though, that gave me a little bit of a pause for thought with the Vampire Counts is they don't have good ranged units. They used to not have any at all. They can now get access to a little bit in the way of ranged units. But still, for the most part, you have to think of them as primarily a melee-oriented faction. But they're quite good at it, and they have really, really strong characters, so something to keep in mind with them. And of the different legendary lords that you can choose for the Vampire Counts, keeping in mind the three things that we like to think of as most important for a starting player. Number one being a lord who has positive effects on your starting army and units that you can recruit right away. And number two being that they're in a really good, safe, stable starting location. For those reasons, we're going with Helman Ghorst. Helman Ghorst is in a pretty stable situation, and he is the ultimate zombie buffer. Now, he's also a good example of how he starts out strong, but his ability is not one of the stronger ones that you would think of as you get into the mid and late game. Now, you should still focus on doing well in the early game, and you'll be just fine. But don't think that he is overall going to be providing maximum benefits the whole way through a campaign. He is strongest in the early going. He buffs zombies, and boy, does he ever buff zombies. So let's go ahead and take a look at what he does here. He's got this casualty replenishment rate, which is really, really nice. He enables poison attacks for your zombies as well as some skeleton units. Really, really nice. Lesser raised dead for Corpse Cart and Mortis Engine units. Pretty nice, which we'll get into in just a second. And this armor bonus for zombies and cryptical units, pretty nice. So you can already start to see all the benefits of having zombies in your army. Now, zombies are usually pretty much just a meat shield unit. They're rubbish. They're not really good for much of anything for anybody else except for Helman Ghorst. Let's go ahead and take a look at him then on the campaign map.
Unleash the gift of undeath.
Okay, so here we are. Helman Ghorst, how they play. You've got bloodlines, blood kisses. The main thing to keep in mind with the vampire counts, however, is raising the dead. So you've got this special ability as vampire counts, and also you get this as well with a vampire coast. You can go in and use this raised dead mechanic, and what this basically means is you're just animating corpses from battlefields all around the world of Warhammer. So the more battles that get fought and the more powerful units fall in battle, the more you have available to you from this raised dead mechanic. But even in the early going, before you fought a single battle, you can already see that you've got some units available that you can recruit in. And the nice thing about the raised dead mechanic is it's instantaneous. So boom, just like Nurgle, you have the ability to get, and Warriors of Chaos as well, you have the ability to get units into your armies instantaneously, which is really, really nice. Most factions don't have that available to them. And furthermore, when you fight battles, if you lose units, you'll find that some of them get put back in your army anyway. They'll be at a reduced strength, but even so, you're just constantly not losing as much in terms of casualties as you would with any other faction. Then you can also just instantaneously add more units to your armies right away. It's a very powerful mechanic, particularly in the early going. You start out with a White King. As always, I'm going to recommend moving your hero into your starting army. And since we're taking a look here, our starting enemy is the Skaven, just like with Malekith and the Dark Elves, starting enemy Skaven. Not really the strongest faction in the world to have to fight against, but you want to make sure that you hit them with overwhelming strength in the early going. So, why not just go ahead and give yourself a couple of extra units here. So let's go ahead and take everything we can on first turn. And how many starting factions, how many starting armies can have 18 units on turn one? Not too many. So we're going to go ahead and attack our starting enemy here. Decisive victory. Again, good opportunity to learn your units, particularly because you've got some really special units here. Helman Ghorst is a really good early game combatant because of the buffs that he provides to units around him. Also, you've got this black coach and this corpse card. So I highly recommend messing around with these. These guys are good at providing buffs, at providing healing, and doing damage to units around them. A lot to like about the starting army here of Helman Ghorst. Obviously, for now, I'm just going to go ahead and do the auto-resolve. So we lost a little bit in the way of casualties, but nothing to worry about. Okay, total dark magic 350 or army replenishment or unit experience. Well, I'm going to take the dark magic. That's essentially what money is called for the vampire counts. And we got ourselves a nice magical weapon there. Mission successful, engaging the enemy. And right away, we'll go ahead and take our level up here. The Restless Dead, this is essentially the same thing as it always is for everybody. It increases our campaign movement. And for you, we'll give you Blade Master. Now, the thing I really wanted to talk about with Helman Ghorst that makes him, I think, a really good faction to start out with for a starting player is down here, the Haunted Forest. This is a single region province. So you've got availability of commandments right away, right out of the gate. It's reasonably strong, and it's highly, highly defensible. So that's really the most important thing. This is not in a location where you really have to worry about an invader coming and taking your starting capital from you anytime soon, which allows you to focus on the offense. Let's go ahead and take a look here at attacking Knobbly Gorge. Decisive victory. Again, easy enough to just auto-resolve. Now, we've taken quite a bit in the way of casualties. You'll take a lot less than that if you fight the battles manually. And quite frankly, you don't really care if you lose. Units like zombies and skeletons, they're so easily replaceable. They're super cheap. Go ahead and occupy. Boom. So there you go. That easy to go ahead and take your second settlement with Helman Ghorst. From here, you've got Cathay over here. In my experience, ultimately they're not going to like you very much, but they don't really declare war on you right away, so you could ignore them if you wanted to. Focus on your enemies over here. That's what I would recommend doing now that you've started this second province, Noblar country here. The rest of that province is over here, so you want to take these out. Shambletown, this is ogres. The other two, these are Skaven. So again, Skaven, not particularly a minor Skaven faction, not really the toughest opponents that you that you would have to worry about in the early going. You do then have Kugath down here. He's actually all the way down here, but if he fights his way up through the Lizardmen here, you would eventually find yourself in a battle with Kugath. As long as you get to, let's say, Shattered Stone Bay before he does, you can keep him bottled up down here in the Dragon Isles pretty effectively, and he should be a quite limited threat, which is kind of ironic considering what's coming up next. That's a little bit of foreshadowing for you, but in any case, hopefully you can see the relative stability and fairly straightforward starting position here of Helman Ghorst. Okay, and so finally, the fifth recommendation that I would make for a starting faction, I really wanted to include one of the demonic factions because that's really what Warhammer 3 is all about, the struggle between chaos and order, the demons invading the world. That's the difference between Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3. Now, it's pretty easy to identify who are the best of the demonic factions to play right now, and that's because with the DLCs that have come out recently, which improve upon the different demon factions, one of them stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of its power. So I'm obviously going to be recommending Kugath as a starting faction. Now, let's talk about him for just a moment. This obviously a year ago would not have been the case. He would have been one of the last ones that people would recommend in terms of using him for a starting player because, well, let's just say that Nurgle had some issues when Warhammer 3 first came out. I personally still loved them. Yes, I'm a little bit biased, and so maybe my bias is creeping into this recommendation as well, but I do feel like I can safely, objectively say that the mechanics for Nurgle are working really well right now. They're one of the better demonic factions. When we take a look at some of these others, you wouldn't want to start out with Scarbrand. He's a really fun legendary lord to play, but his mechanics are he plays out completely differently than pretty much anybody else does, so not a good one to start out with. It doesn't really give you a chance to learn how this game feels because he is so unique. Same thing could probably be said for Tzeentch. He's got really sophisticated mechanics that take a lot of getting used to. Can be reasonably powerful, but pretty advanced mechanically, I would say. And then Slaanesh. I've probably played less Slaanesh than the others. I quite like them, but I don't think their mechanics are anywhere near with the seduction. I don't think they're nearly as accessible as Nurgle is, and additionally, I don't think they're as powerful as Nurgle is right now. Nurgle is for somebody who's learning how to fight battles, Nurgle, kind of like the Dwarves, Nurgle is a good defensive melee infantry type of a faction with some powerful units that you can then use as damage dealers. Slaanesh is more about speed. They're not quite as rugged and durable as Nurgle is. And so for that reason, I think Nurgle wins out in terms of being the most accessible of the demonic factions. Tamarkon, having played through him, and Epidemius, both very fun campaigns, quite a bit more sophisticated mechanics than Kugath has himself. And the main reason why I would recommend Kugath as a starting legendary lord goes back to what I mentioned about you like to have a legendary lord who is good with the early game units. So let's go ahead and jump into a Kugath campaign and talk about why he is so good.
We shall shower our foes in plague, pox, violence, and sickness, then revel in the rot.
Okay, so Kugath. Little bit of a slightly more complicated mechanic than the other factions that we've talked about. I did mention, just like with the Raise Dead mechanic that the vampire counts have, Kugath recruits into his army immediately, but they don't come in at full strength. So that's sort of the trade-off that you've got with him. He summons units into his armies instead of recruiting them. We'll show you an example of that in just a moment. He uses plagues, which is, I think, a really well done mechanic that we'll talk about in just a second as well. Now, your starting situation. This is a little bit unique of all of the ones that I've recommended so far because he is the only one who doesn't start with the provincial capital. This provincial capital is actually up here at Dreadrock. So that's going to be your number one priority in the early game, is to take Dreadrock. Once you do, the rest of the campaign is smooth sailing. But you start out down here with Dragonfang Mount. Now, this is still for a minor settlement, this is still a really nice minor settlement because you've got yourself a port, which provides really good income right here. 800 per turn once you get this up to level 3, so that's excellent. It's got a resource here that's kind of nice to get. And you've got yourself, since the rework happened with Thrones of Decay, you got yourself really nice, well-balanced, well-thought-out buildings overall for your settlements, unlike was the case prior to Thrones of Decay. So anyway, it's a pretty good starting minor settlement, but you definitely want to try to get Dreadrock as quickly as possible. Now, you do start out up here in enemy territory, so you can't summon in right away. What you need to do, obviously, get your hero into your army here. And you want to go ahead and fight your first battle. Close victory. You can go ahead. Again, I highly, highly recommend fighting this one manually because you don't want to suffer heavy casualties in this first battle because you're going to want them for your second battle. But again, I'm going to go ahead and auto-resolve just for expediency. So we took pretty significant casualties right there. In the early going, I think it's generally a good idea. Definitely favor is always, and this favor is Nurgle's version, really all the demons' version of money. So always good to get some of that, but also very good to get infections. I'm going to go ahead and choose the infections here. So we've won our starting battle here, wiped out the enemy army, and we've gotten the benefits for finishing that objective. We're going to go ahead and take our route marcher, and we're going to go ahead and give you replenished troops. Extremely important to get replenished troops. Now, let's take a look here at Kugath's skill line. And so this is what I wanted to mention in particular with him being so strong in the early going, and that is he buffs Nurglings. So just like how zombies are a fairly useless unit for every other legendary lord except for Helman Ghorst, it's the same thing with Nurglings for every other legendary lord except for Kugath. Kugath, on the other hand, actually gives your Nurglings things like regeneration, which is wonderful. Melee defense bonus. He's really good. He's got multiple ways of buffing your Nurglings, including down here in the red line. There, right there. So, Armor of Malady. Once you get 3 points into this, you're looking at plus 12 armor and plus 6 melee defense for Nurglings, which, considering that Nurglings start out with only 24 melee defense and 0 armor, that's a pretty significant increase. They're really cheap units. They have pretty good attacking animation, so they tend to be fairly effective in battle when you're using them in manual battles. So anyway, really recommended that you can hire a lot of what is normally a fairly worthless unit into a Kugath army, and it makes him fairly powerful. And with an almost entirely Nurgling army, Kugath can actually really dominate in the early going. So again, you can go ahead and reach the starting settlement of the enemy here. You can attack them in the first turn. If I do the auto-resolve, we don't lose any units. Boom, we have taken over our second settlement, and we're already in a position to head towards the capital of this province. It is a little bit more difficult to take the capital of the province because it's a walled settlement, so you do get a little bit in the way of needing to strategically outmaneuver the lizardmen, but their army starts out over here. They don't have an army over here. Certainly you can have the opportunity to blitz your way over here and take that. You get pretty good replenishment with Kugath. Nurgle has just overall some good avenues for good replenishment. Here I mentioned the ability to summon units right in, but when you do summon them in, they come in at only partial strength. I would recommend, if you're really interested in going as quickly as possible for Dreadrock, which I do recommend, go ahead and recruit in a bunch of units into your army. Personally, I think that's usually sufficient. You want to recruit them in. As you can see, they didn't come in at full strength, so you want to do it in turn number 1 so they can start replenishing right away. Kugath, like I said, let's go ahead and start working on being able to give him the Armor of Malady here, so I usually go right away into the red line on him. You're Plague-ridden, definitely very powerful magic that you can use. Rancid Visitations is good against enemy lords. Children of Nurgle, very useful passive ability, which heals your units every time you cast a spell. Probably the spell that you'll use more than any other. Fleshy Abundance, really nice to have a heal available to you. And then Blight Boil is just one of my favorite spells. It's a pretty heavy damage dealing spell whenever you've got enemies pinned down and a bunch of them closely packed. Okay, so anyway, this army in turn number 1 already took a settlement, already recruited up to be size 17, in pretty good position to move towards Dreadrock starting next turn. And what else is there to mention with Nurgle? Well, of course, we have to talk about the plagues. Now, I can't actually show the screen just yet, but basically, as you get more and more infections, you'll unlock the ability to apply different buffs to your armies, to your settlements, or debuffs to enemy armies and enemy settlements. Simple as that. Most of them are pretty straightforward and easy to understand. I find this to be a well thought out mechanic compared to how it used to be. So again, highly recommended Kugath for a starting player who's interested in playing one of the demonic factions. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and leave it there. This ended up, as usual, running a little bit longer than I expected it to, but hopefully some people will find this useful. Maybe some of you have some familiarity with some of the other lords, feel like I didn't give them a fair shake in terms of being accessible to starting players. So please feel free to leave any comments that you might like. Any advice that I may have missed to starting players, feel free to add that as well. And at this point, I will go ahead and say thank you all for watching and for listening, and I will see you in the next video.